Welcome everybody on this suddenly very fall afternoon, and I think that I know this will be just a really wonderful panel on a very, very important topic and period in Cuban history, one that really deserves a great deal more attention. So I think we'll get directly into, I'm Julie Skursky. I teach here at the Graduate Center in anthropology, and I do research in Cuba. So I'd like to get started with our panel and our really very interesting presenters. Our first speaker will be Samuel Farber on the Frustrated Revolution of 1933 and its consequences. And Professor Farber, who is the author of many books, most recently the book The Politics of Che Guevara, Theory and Practice. He's also the author of an earlier book giving it's titled, I'm not remembering exactly, but a revised history of the Cuban Revolution. And so I think we will just start with Professor Farber and then continue with the rest of the members of the panel.
Good, thank you, Julie.
Whoa, this is tight.
Good afternoon. You are the true souls who venture against. You are the true souls who venture against wind and rain and so on. You deserve applause. I want to talk about the frustrated. I want to emphasize frustrated revolution of 1933 and its consequences. As many of us here in this room know, in 1933, the dictatorship of Gerardo Machado was overthrown in a popular revolution, and some gains, to be sure, were obtained from that revolution. A sort of a Cuban version of the New Deal was established in the country with the 8-hour day and some other labor legislation. Some democratic gains were made, like the women's suffrage, which began to take effect in the phony elections of 1936. But essentially, a democratic system of government did not come into fruition until well into the 40s. So I don't mean to suggest that he was totally frustrated, but frustration means something other than what you were aiming for, and considerably less than what the Cuban people were aiming for. And the most fundamental questions that were presented to the revolution, the goals were frustrated. No agrarian reform. In terms of national independence, the situation was a little more complicated. We have to bear in mind that the revolution of '33 was explicitly, and I repeat, explicitly anti-imperialist, which was not the case up to January 1st, 1959, in the '59 revolution. It became anti-imperialist after victory. But in Cuba, the revolution was explicitly anti-imperialist before Machado was overthrown. It is true, the Platt Amendment was abolished, but the Guantanamo naval base remained as American property to this very day. And of course, the United States retained, for lack of a better word, a sort of an informal veto power over Cuban politics, behind the scene. Most important of all, as a price to pay for the abolition of the Platt Amendment, a reciprocity treaty, an economic reciprocity treaty was signed in 1944 that essentially enthroned sugar monoculture of the Cuban economy, and that prevented the development of import substitution that, as you know, was widely established and helped, at least initially, to promote economic development in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, in Latin America. That option was eliminated because of the reciprocity treaties that was signed in '34 and then amended or renewed in the subsequent years. Sugar remained king, but the situation was worse than before '33 because now there was a tariff system that was established. That is, before, up to the 1930s, Cuban sugar could compete freely with other sugar-producing countries, and indeed, at least until 1920, it was really, it was in the underlying factor for the greatest economic surge that you ever had. That is from roughly the first 20 years, particularly of the 20th century. So the reciprocity treaty system prevented, again, a decisive break from sugar monoculture, except at the margins. Like some inroads were made in the cultivation of rice and so on, but fundamentally, the reciprocity treaty system prevented that from happening. This discussed, in my view, as an effect of the revolution of 1933, was the impact it had on Cuban class structure and politics. If we look at Cuba before 1933, I would call it, and I have called it, a half-baked oligarchy. And what I mean by that is an oligarchy is a classic case would be Argentina for a good part of the 20th century, where church, army, and upper classes were very tightly connected and creating a true wall, almost impregnable wall against social change. There was a half-baked version of that, with an army with a white, overwhelmingly, not exclusively, overwhelmingly white officer class that had excluded the majority, in fact, of black independence fighters from becoming part of the political system, including control over the army. You had, before 33, you had the white caciques and caudillos, like Mario Garcia Manocal, whose picture is right here, you know, who were closely associated with U.S. economic interests. He was a sugar mill owner, and he was very, very closely associated with American sugar interests. There was still a significant Spanish capital in Cuba, that the spokesperson for which was the El Diario de la Marina, a very old pro-Spanish, pro-oligarchic newspaper in Cuba, and the traditional, as in the rest of Latin American, liberal or conservative parties trying to alternate in office, representing different wings of the ruling classes. That half-baked oligarchy, and I say half-baked because for many reasons that I don't have the time to go into, it never really come into full fruition. Be that as it may, the combination of the revolution of 33 and the depression laid waste to that system. In the army, the fate of the officer class was settled at the Hotel Nacional, when the white officer class was pretty much eliminated from the picture by the surging group of sergeants led by Fulgencio Batista, and that introduced a very different type of army leadership in Cuba. The liberal and conservative parties fell by the wayside. They didn't completely disappear, as we know, but they fell by the wayside as the predominant party organizations. And that, together with that, there was a weakened political role of capital in Cuba. And at the same time that there was a weakened political role for capital, for Cuban capital in Cuba, there was also, at the same time, and not surprisingly, because the two things often go together, an increase in state autonomy. There is a state institutions that became autonomous and were not really under control of or responding, I should say, to a settled class structure as you have in oligarchy situations. Thus, for example, in 1937, the Instituto Cubano de Estabilización del Azúcar was established in Cuba to regulate the sugar in a way that I don't have the time to go into, we can discuss it later, that made mincemeat out of the marketplace. And if anything, it was not run in Cuba by the laws of the marketplace was sugar, because it was a politically managed, the principal section of the Cuban economy, the ISEA, through its annual agreements managed and that market. And of course, it was influenced by the international market, to be sure, but it was fundamentally a politically administered system. So you have here, with the demise of the liberal conservative party and the surge of parties such as the Authenticos and the Ortodoxos that had a much weaker social base in the country. Neither the Authenticos and even less the Orthodoxos had a significant, for example, labor base. They had broad-scale sympathy in the population, but not what could be called an organic base of support like labor parties do in Europe and also social democratic parties in countries like Venezuela did at one time. At the same time, the unions, whether under Authentico or communist leadership, became increasingly bureaucratized. And in part, the communists themselves admitted after the Batista coup, they themselves admitted that they had contributed very significantly to that bureaucratization of labor. So you had essentially a capitalist and imperialist subject system in Cuba that didn't have what could be called a proper ruling class. And at the same time, you had this autonomization, this state autonomy, as I tried to show in the case of the ISEA, the establishment of ISEA in 1937. Now, what does that mean? And I think that the last point I want to talk about is how this new situation that was created in 1933 had an influence on the revolution, the kind of revolution that was the 1959 revolution. In other words, these events were not purely a question of historical curiosity, but in my view had a tremendous impact on the shape that the 1959 revolution would take. Why do I say so? On what basis do I say so? On one basis in which I say so is by trying to use a comparative analysis with other revolutions that took place in Latin America at the same time. In the period of the Cold War, as many of us know, the military coup d'etats that took place in a variety of countries, in Colombia, Venezuela, in Cuba, Peru, it was full of dictators, Latin America. I don't claim, by the way, that the coup d'etat in Cuba was organized by the United States. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that. But once the coup took place, the State Department was only too happy to recognize it and very quickly, by the way, to recognize it as the constitutional government. Now, when we look at then all these dictatorships in the 50s, we see that as one by one they were being overthrown by a combination of sections of the army collaborating with traditional political parties. In the case of Venezuela, whether it was COPEI and the Acción Democrática and Vito, what was his name? Vito, I forgot his name. Vito, the third party that was through, well,
Jovito Villalba, sí.
Villalba, right. So these were fairly established traditional parties, and the same similar phenomenon took place in other Latin American countries. Not in Cuba. In Cuba, the traditional political parties, or whatever was left of it, completely collapsed. Authentics and Ortodoxos could not and did not play the role that the Acción Democrática or that other parties, or for that matter, liberals and conservatives in Colombia, played in the process of getting rid of dictators. That failed. Sections of the army, and this I think is a particularly significant thing to be noted in the case of Cuba, that when the part of the officer class in Cuba tried to overthrow the Batista's government in 1956, not only did they fail, but they were called los puros, the pure. That is, those officers, like Martín, Borbonera, and all those people who tried to overthrow Batista, they were called los puros. That is, they're pure, we're not. There was a frank admission, at least an implicit admission, that they are pure, were corrupt. And the pure were defeated. So, nothing coming out of the traditional army succeeded. Nothing coming out of the traditional parties succeeded, unlike it was the case in other Latin American countries. So this comparative analysis, to me at any rate, is very suggestive. And that's why given the failure of the political parties, given the failure of the pure wing of the army, then there was a space that was open for a guerrilla force with very strong popular support, but led by what I call a D-class group. By D-class group, what I mean precisely by that is a group of people, I'm talking about Fidel, Raúl Castro, and the close-knit, Che Guevara and so on, the close-knit group in the Sierra Maestra, who had no organic affiliations to any social class organizations. That wasn't true for all of them. By the way, Frank Pais, for example, had very strong ties to the Baptist Church, and his whole family did as well. So it was not a uniform phenomenon, but the key grouping in the Sierra Maestra was detached from the important institutions in what could be called Cuban civic society, whether that be the Catholic Church, whether that be unions, whether that be the Rotary Club, whatever you want to talk about. So that's what I think that the results of 33 had a decisive and important influence on what happened in 59. Thank you.
I'm making around and there's coffee until 5 o'clock. To sell coffee at 5 o'clock. So if you want coffee or tea, do it now.
Thank you, Professor Farber. Our next speaker will be Francis G. Sullivan, and who works in the Department of History and Literature at Harvard, and who researches transnational and social movements in the Americas. And her current book project is Cosmopolitan Enclaves. I think that she'll be speaking on something related to that. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you guys for organizing the panel. So my work focuses on the history of transnational activism in Cuba's Sugar Enclaves. And just to show you where, this is the region that I mainly study. Well, it doesn't matter. The northeastern coast between Puerto Padre and the Banes and Nipe Bays. Oh, there's a map over there, okay. My current book project is called Cosmopolitan Enclaves, and it traces Cuba's sugar workers, both immigrants and foreign, as they participated in 3 major movements for transnational solidarity, starting with the Universal Negro Improvement Association, led by Jamaican Marcus Garvey, so we call it Garveyism, world communism in the 1930s, and anti-fascist support for the Spanish Republic in the end of the 30s. Those 3 movements shared roots in a world increasingly dominated by U.S. hegemony, racialized labor exploitation, and worker mobility, and they developed in conversation with one another, even though we often look at them in isolation. I argue that networks of capital, migration, and ideas created in the wake of U.S. imperialism, in fact facilitated the growth of very cosmopolitan local societies, where women and men, in turn, envisioned their own struggles in global terms and thus linked up with wider internationalist efforts. So today I'm going to share a small piece of that project, which is still, I warn you, very much in progress. Mauricio has asked me to speak about the Sugar Insurgency of 33. And so with regard to that insurgency, I'm interested in exploring the interplay between sugar workers themselves and what others said about sugar workers, particularly in wider leftist circles. This was a moment when the island's nationally diverse sugar workforce erupted in insurgency, and laborers who had long been dismissed by the communist left were suddenly trumpeted as proletarian internationalists exemplified. I believe the story of 33 challenges kind of predominant notions, not just in Cuban circles, or certainly not in Cuban circles, but in wider historiographical circles, about what constitutes the core and the center of radical politics. But I also look forward to hearing your thoughts during the Q&A. On August 12, 1933, when President General Gerardo Machado fled Havana workers in the United Fruit Company town of Banes celebrated in the streets. So there's the map that kind of shows you where Banes is. With revolutionary fervor of the preceding months still spreading in towns and cities across the island, and with the future of the country still uncertain, United Fruit laborers declared a 2-day general strike. The strike was the first labor action in United Fruit Company territory in which all sectors of the plantation participated, including tradesmen, who typically did get involved in strikes, but also factory and field workers. Although the Rural Guard broke up the general meetings later that month, workers succeeded in declaring another brief strike on August 22nd. They formed a labor organization incorporating all sectors of the local economy, a strike committee, red militias of armed men and relief committees. On August 28th, the strike committee held a general assembly and presented a list of demands to the company. When the company only accepted some of these demands, the workers declared a general strike. The strike committee and red militias quickly took control over most of the plantation, including the mill, electrical plant, and railroad, as well as administrative offices. Administrators complained that they could only travel back and forth between their homes and offices, escorted by the red militia. The strikers formed a relief kitchen using company supplies, and women cooked meals for striking workers. Members of the local trade guilds, including shoemakers, bakers, tobacco rollers, and others, joined the insurgency. The strike action spread to United Fruit's other major mill, which is called Preston, where workers also froze production. And at the nearby port of Antilla, they raised a red flag over City Hall. Significantly, Afro-Antillanos participated in this insurgency. United Fruit, like most other sugar companies in the early 20th century, found that they could not fulfill their labor needs with displaced Cuban peasants alone, and so they imported workers from the Black Caribbean. In all, an estimated 600,000 Antillanos arrived in Cuba in the first third of the 20th century. Although many left after each harvest, others stayed. And I just want to, here's my last slide, really. But it's a map of sugar mills in Cuba to give you a sense of the geography. And I'm mostly talking about the eastern provinces of Camagüey and Oriente. The August strikes were among the first labor actions in United Fruit territory to include field workers, the majority of whom were from Haiti and Jamaica. West Indian domestic servants also joined the strike, and company managers complained bitterly and constantly about having to go without cooks, chauffeurs, laundresses, and housekeepers. According to sugar union representatives, strike actions in the United Fruit Zone involved as many as 6,000 individuals in a united bloc of Cuban, Jamaican, Haitian, and Chinese workers. The strikes in Banes were part of a wider insurgency taking place across the sugar fields and towns of Cuba over the course of the 1933 revolution. The uprising began before Machado's departure, but continued through the autumn under the short-lived administration of Ramon Grau San Martin. Here's the workers also mills. Workers demanded the right to organize, the right to strike, wages at 1930 levels, an 8-hour workday, overtime pay, cancellation of company stored debt, an end to worker expulsions, and housing during the off-season, which was growing every year as the harvest was shortened. They occupied mills and land, and as we have seen in Banes, overtook additional company holdings. By late September, 36 mills, representing about 1/3 of the island's sugar production, were controlled by strike committees. In Banes, the strike that began on August 28th completely paralyzed the plantation for 8 days. Although the army was quickly dispatched to Banes, soldiers were caught fraternizing with strikers and were less than effective at suppressing the uprising. With the sergeant's revolt that led by Fulgencio Batista, on September 4, the company agreed to most of the workers' demands, and the workers, for their part, accepted a rather limited offer in light of the American destroyer sitting in the Nipe Bay. Shorter strikes continued, though, and on October 9th, a strike began in Banes after the company guards arrested 3 union leaders, and it only ended when they were released. When workers struck again on November 27th to block an abusive foreman from returning to work, solidarity strikes broke out across the region. You can kind of imagine where it is. And that only ended when the company withdrew the foreman. On January 2nd, a federal Federación Obrero Regional de Banes was established, but by then the tides had turned against the workers. So by the end of January 1934, the new Batista Mendieta government had declared there will be harvest or there will be blood, and violently suppressed the labor insurgency. In Banes, a planned February 5 strike failed, and another 2 strikes failed. Around this time, sugar companies began evicting labor leaders and their families, sharing lists of organizers, and bringing in workers from across the island. By the time United Fruit began milling on February 23rd, in what was to become known as the Bloody Safra, that's harvest, the company claimed to have replaced 50% of its factory workers. Across the island, Cubans and Antillanos alike were targeted with arrest and incarceration, and significant numbers were murdered. So throughout this whole sugar insurgency, the Partido Comunista de Cuba claimed leadership over events unfolding on the ground. And I did a lot of work at the Instituto de Historia de Cuba in La Havana, and they offer no shortage of documents in which the communists say that they are at the forefront of the rebellion. I could name some flyers, but just one example is a sugar union flyer saying 200,000 sugar workers, unemployed, employed, native and foreign, all got together under the revolutionary line of the Communist Party. International organizers also broadcast this message, including a New York-based communist newspaper that was directed specifically at the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. The reality on the ground seems to have been a lot more complicated, however. Historians Barry Carr and Robert Whitney, among others, have demonstrated this. And I can confirm what they have found, which is that at some mills, the party was in constant communication with the strikers, including the Mabe mill, where I found lists of demands that exactly replicated party platform. At other mills, however, there were different groups vying for power, such as the Cuban American Sugar Company's Chapata mill, where the Trotskyites and the communists fought about it. Finally, the party seemed to arrive late on the scene at several mills, only to find that workers had already set up Red Guards and militias without any outside assistance. Only in a few brief moments do we see the communist outlets kind of let slip an awareness that they were not entirely in control of events, such as a Mundo Obrero article in which the author wrote, literally between parentheses, "There have been some strikes of a spontaneous character, but they were more or less influenced by CUNY, which is the National Labor Union." Similarly, in interviews conducted in 1986 in Cuba as part of a labor history project reveal a mixed story. And I was fascinated in the archives by this interview with Rafael Hernandez, a former United Fruit sugar worker. And he claims that the party directed events on the ground. Yet when he was pressed for specifics, he kept mentioning, well, that group wasn't yet a member of the party, and that group wasn't yet affiliated with the party. And then he was always quick to add, well, everything was oriented towards the workers' movement, and that was influenced by the party. So finally, he kind of lets it slip that in Banes, the party only reached to the workers when they had been evicted and formed a cooperative off the plantation. This deliberate claim of leadership, despite the messier reality, however, suggests how profound the insurgency was to communist leaders. After all, the Sugar Insurgency represented everything local and international communist organizers in the early 1930s hoped to achieve. It was a moment of transracial, transnational worker solidarity, striking a blow at the heart of U.S. imperialism. With its historic Sixth Congress in Moscow, the Third International launched its famous Third Period, which was marked by class struggle and proletarian internationalism. The Comintern had made the discovery of Latin America, and after decades of pressure from new Negro intellectuals, it had moved decisively on the Negro question, resolving that black liberation was inherently tied to revolutionary anti-imperialist struggles. And in my larger project, I focus a lot on the Scottsboro case, which is when 9 young African Americans in Scottsboro, Alabama were arrested on trumped-up rape charges. The Communist Party globally rallied around their cause, but in Cuba there was a massive mobilization for their release. So organizing workers of all races, but especially black workers across nationalities under the red flag was to become a top priority. Following the Sixth Congress, Latin American communists had two major meetings, one in Montevideo and one in Buenos Aires, and at both they really discussed questions about race, agricultural labor, especially wage labor on big, the fiefdoms of Yankee power, companies like United Fruit Company. And at one point, an Afro-Cuban representative explicitly mentioned the importance of the Garvey movement, which I also studied, in citing why we should reach out to black workers. In the context of these transnational discussions about race, agricultural labor, and imperialism, it's no wonder that the communists heralded the sugar insurgency as their own. Indeed, the global left looked on with rapt attention as events unfolded on the ground. During the early stirrings of the strikes, Cuba's foremost and communist intellectual Ruben Martinez Villena wrote, "The strike movement on the sugar centrales is the most important political development in Cuba today." Similarly, the Mundo Obrero argued that the strikes must be objects of intense scrutiny and widespread popularization. The CSLA, the Confederación Sindical Latinoamericana, and other international organizations supported the takeovers, and there were actually protests of support here in New York in front of the Cuban consulate. In short, the global left turned its attention, albeit briefly, to the Cuban sugar factories and fields when, as the CSLA put it, sugar workers had elevated the anti-imperialist, anti-feudal struggle of all of Latin America. So despite all of these claims of leadership of the insurrection in the sugar fields, the party had only recently begun organizing sugar workers. In fact, in my opinion, they came rather late to the game. To their credit, it was hard to get out to the sugar centrales and colonos, cane farms, but at the same time, they were dismissive of the revolutionary potential of foreign workers. So I'll skip over some of the stuff that I have on that. But basically, over the course of 1932, the Communist Party sent youth league members out to document conditions in the field and found that indeed antillanos were quite important and that they were also quite militant at different times. And they came to be fierce defenders of foreign workers in the face of anti-immigrant repression. The idea of national reconquest took root during the Revolution of '33, and the Grau administration issued a number of decrees nationalizing labor. And the most famous is the famous Ley 50, saying that 50% of any workers in a given company should be native Cubans. Although agricultural workers were largely exempt from this law, these laws were still very popular and resulted in a lot of violence towards foreign workers, including the forced deportations of almost 5,000 Haitians. The Communist Party and its sister organizations ardently defended these immigrant workers, claiming that the legislation was intended to divide the working classes and to increase racial tension. They launched a campaign against anti-black terror and encouraged meetings, demonstrations, strikes, and protests. However, the Ley 50 remained popular. And in fact, when the Communist Party tried to organize a massive strike against the nationalization laws, there was actually, not only did the strike fail, there was a march in Havana supporting the legislation. 20,000 people marched. In the midst of this nationalist fervor, communist opposition to the new legislation pitted the party against its base of working classes and unemployed in Cuba. So in 1936, the party quickly switched its positions on nationalization and shifted from being the Ley 50's only and most vigorous opponent to an ardent defender. And I won't go into details, but I found in the archives a document, a carta abierta from CNOC announcing this revision and sort of acknowledging the previous eras. And you can watch in the multiple drafts of the document how the party slowly transitions away from sugar and the countryside to the cities, away from transnational proletarian solidarity towards the fight for Cuban employment, and away from third period internationalism towards Popular Front nationalism. Thank goodness for multiple drafts. So in conclusion, at the height of a peak period in the history of what we might call globalization from below, that is the interwar period when solidarity movements took off across the world, a remarkable moment of cross-national insurgency erupted where we might least expect it. The sugar fields and factories of Cuba, spaces which are still famous for labor segregation and subordination at the time. Sugar workers announced themselves on the scene just as the Cuban Party, which was influenced by new directives from Moscow, by the Negro question, by regional discussions of race and agricultural labor, began considering their revolutionary potential. Sugar laborers showed the CPs just what it meant to put proletarian internationalism into practice. But their insurrection also underscores the limits of internationalism, as the strikes were crushed by Batista's political repression and Depression-era nativism, which was common across the Americas. The party, once again undergoing a transition, abruptly changed positions, abandoned its support for antillanos, and began a long game plan for entry into mainstream politics. Eastern Cuba's internationalism, however, could not be contained for long. The story of 1933-34 invites us to consider the generative power of events taking place at the margins, and following the individual participants in the sugar insurgency reveals its widespread reverberations. Many British West Indians returned home, where they were active in the general strikes of 1938 and 39 that swept Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica, and beyond. Haitian novelist Jacques Romain's most famous novel, Masters of the Dew, is about a migrant returning home from Cuba with a newfound sense of labor militancy. And back in Cuba, by the late 1830s, the sugar zone was again steeped in popular internationalism, as some of the very insurrectionists who took over mills in 1933 joined the mobilization to defend Republican Spain against Franco's fascist uprising. Towns like Banes led the movement in numbers disproportionate to their size, and you can measure that with all sorts of metrics, and exile networks established in the wake of Batista's 34 repression supported a new base of activism abroad. In fact, so many Cubans from the Sugar Zone lived in Spain that by the outbreak of civil war in 36, a contingent of Cubans from Oriente were among the first to enlist in the militias defending the Republic. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Daniel Rodriguez, who teaches history, and whose work specializes and focuses on issues of public health, medicine, and disease in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he's currently working on a book, A Blessed Formula for Progress, The Politics of Health, Medicine, and Welfare in Havana, 1897 to 1935.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. Microphone, okay. So today I'm going to talk about the Cuban medical strikes of 1934, outlining both the roots of the strike in Havana's unique medical system that developed in the early years of the 20th century, and in the broader labor mobilizations that characterized Cuba in the early 1930s. So the presentation is based on research that I did for an article that I published earlier this year in Hispanic American Historical Review, and which I'm currently revising for the book manuscripts that Julie Skursky mentioned. All right. So on the morning of January 19th, 1934, over 25,000 Cuban medical workers, which represented the overwhelming majority of the country's doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and midwives, staged the largest medical strike in Cuban history. Across the island, all public and private hospitals, clinics, dispensaries, and pharmacies stopped caring for the sick. Workers from the Ministry of Health walked off in solidarity with the strikers. Midwives refused to attend births, and doctors refused to perform autopsies or sign death certificates, leaving bodies slowly piling up in the city's morgues. City residents, for lack of better options, brought the sick and wounded to police stations where they were treated, quote, by laymen. One woman, unable to find any doctors or midwives, was driven to the police station in search of medical help, quote, having given birth in the middle of the transport which brought her. According to the Diario de la Marina, the strike, quote, provided in Havana and in all of the cities of the Republic the painful spectacle of the sick cast out of hospitals and the clinics abandoned without mercy for the wounded, while the pharmacies remained closed, refusing to sell medicine to the public. The newspaper named more than 15 patients that died in Havana, just in Havana, without medical attention. One American observer described the general chaos of the moment. Quote, critically ill patients were abandoned, equipment was destroyed, and general panic ensued. Relatives and friends flocked to the hospitals to care for the suffering and dying patients. Surgeons were kidnapped at gunpoint by frantic husbands and fathers forced to attend patients. I've been looking everywhere for other sources that back up that image of surgeons being kidnapped and forced to attend surgeries. But I just think it's a wonderful quote. But I don't know about that. So in retaliation for the strike, medical offices and pharmacies were bombed. Pharmacists were attacked by angry mobs, and a physician in Havana was shot to death. So the strikers were organized under the, quote, United Front of Medical Workers, which presented to the new Mendieta government a common list of demands, including an 8-hour workday for medical workers, higher wages for all medical workers of all sectors of the medical all aspects, all different kinds of medical workers, and the official recognition of the union. But the immediate cause of the general medical strike was the government's non-enforcement of the Ley de Colegiación Médica Obligatoria, a law that required all physicians to be members in good standing of the National Medical College. The law had been passed under the short-lived government of Grau San Martin in the fall of 1933, but under pressure from the powerful Spanish immigrant groups, the law was never enforced. As I'll show today, the issue was not just the regulation of medical practice, but whether the powerful centros regionales, the Spanish immigrant societies that controlled these private hospitals, would accede to the labor demands of the Cuban Medical Federation, the Federación de Médicos Cubanos, or the FMC. On a more fundamental level, physicians argued, this was a struggle over the future of Cuban medicine. So the conflicto médico, as it became known, combined medical labor struggles with the nationalist politics of the period and anti-Spanish sentiment. which was a combustible mix in a time of political and economic instability. The historiography of 1933 has tended to focus on the important role played by sugar workers and urban labor in pushing for a radical restructuring of Cuban society. But as I hope to show today, different social sectors across the island responded to and helped shape this revolutionary conjuncture of 1933 to 1935. For Cuban physicians, the ouster of Machado both exacerbated existing political tensions within the medical sector and presented new opportunities to use this moment of social and political change to advance the concerns of Cuban doctors. And revolutionary politics also influenced a new generation of young leftist doctors and medical students who organized into the Ala Izquierda Médica, or the medical left wing, and pushed the Medical Federation to link its class interests to the broader political and social problems of the Cuban people. After a painful medical strike, the failure of international mediation efforts, and the increased government hostility to the demands of Cuban doctors, the medical sector seemed to have exhausted the possibilities for change within the system. Cuban physicians increasingly believed that the private medical system itself was fundamentally broken. And as I argue, this conjuncture created an opening for the Ala Izquierda and its allies within the broader Cuban left to push medical workers to link their struggles to those of their patients and to consider the radical restructuring of Cuban medical practice. So the conflicto médico emerged out of what were like really specific conditions of medical labor in Havana, which really have no analog anywhere else in the Americas, certainly, where a handful of powerful Spanish immigrant mutual aid organizations came to dominate the medical landscape. So I guess a brief word of introduction for those of you that are familiar with these immigrant organizations. In early 20th century Cuba, Havana's many Spanish immigrant organizations were prominent and important institutions in the city's public life. Initially founded as mutual aid organizations for working class peninsular immigrants, the Centros Regionales brought together immigrants from particular groups of Spain. The Centro Canario was Canarians, people from the Canary Islands, Centro Gallego was Galicians, etc., etc. And at the height of their membership, the three largest and oldest centros, the Centro Asturiano, Centro Gallego, and Centro de Dependientes, had together 176,000 members, drawn largely from Havana's residents. So you can see like how this was like a hugely important set of institutions in the city. Now, by far their most important service was the medical care that members received. Their hospitals were among the best equipped in the country, and members would come from across the island for treatment at the Centro Asturiano's Covadonga Hospital or for the Centro Gallego's Hospital La Verifica. And that actually includes two of my great uncles who in the early 1930s traveled all the way from Puerto Padre to actually wound up dying in La Covadonga of tuberculosis, but to get treated for tuberculosis in Covadonga. So these were nationally important institutions as well. And all of these benefits were available for a very modest monthly fee, generally within the reach of most Spanish immigrant workers. But while the centros were originally mutual aid organizations for the immigrant working class, their membership increasingly included Cubans of Spanish descent, with Cubans of African descent being explicitly excluded, and as well as a growing number of bankers, merchants, and other elite sectors of Spanish immigrant society. And indeed, the central conflict between the centros and the Cuban Medical Federation was the issue of whether the centros should allow wealthy residents to become members and receive the same access to low-cost medical care as the working class membership. So while many factors led to the 1925 formation of the Cuban Medical Federation, the most important was the increasingly precarious economic situation of Cuban doctors by the 1920s, which they believed was due to the distorting effects of the Centros Regionales on the medical marketplace of Havana. So according to the FMC, the Centros drove down wages for physicians who faced increasing competition in an already overcrowded medical marketplace in Havana. And just to kind of give you a little background, so step back a little bit, it's important to note that Cuba, like many other countries in Latin America, had a very unequal geographic distribution of physicians. So with high rates of rural poverty, relatively few doctors were able to make a living outside of the capital. So, and according to a 1934 report, almost half of the country's physicians lived and practiced within the city limits of Havana. But a large percentage of the city's residents were covered either by public medical services or were members of the centros regionales, right? So approximately 40% of the population received low-cost medical care through the centros, and 37% of the population was eligible due to their poverty for medical care in one of the city's public clinics. So this left the 1,200 Cuban physicians that were practicing within the city to compete for less than a quarter of the urban population that purchased medical services on the open market. What made this situation especially untenable for the Federation's doctors was the fact that the centros regionales allowed their wealthiest members to access the same low-cost medical care, thereby denying Cuban physicians access to them as paying clients. So the result was the increased underemployment of Cuban doctors and a decline of physicians' incomes for this period. So medicine, which I look at and sort of look at the development of Cuban medicine throughout my book manuscript, but was increasingly over the course of the 19-teens, like in the wake of independence, was seen as a really important route to middle class status. And the numbers of students that were studying medicine at the University of Havana expands rapidly after 1905, becoming half of all students that are at the University of Havana are studying medicine by the 1920s. So that creates a glut of medical labor, which is increasingly, of course, becomes a problem in the context of this competition in the city. So already suffering from the twin problems of medical competition in Havana on the one hand, and the Centros Regionales' domination of the medical marketplace of Havana on the other hand, the post-1925 economic depression dealt Cuban physicians a massive blow. So with unemployment high and wages dropping, the city's market for private medical services contracts sharply. So urban residents, in other words, could no longer afford to pay for medical services. By the early 1930s, the Cuban medical profession was in a state of crisis. So as Robert Whitney argues, the late 1920s were marked by a period of increased mobilization, or marked by increased mobilization of groups that had traditionally been outside of the political process, such as students, professors, urban and rural workers, and lower-ranked soldiers. Channeling a growing opposition to Machado, disaffection with corrupt politicians and political institutions, and resistance to U.S. political and economic control, these emerging groups transformed Cuban politics, as we've talked about. While originally organized around ostensibly apolitical professional and economic issues, Cuban physicians grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw as government complicity with the deterioration of medical practice on the island, and increasingly made political demands and pushed the Federation to openly tackle political issues. Over the course of the early 1930s, as the anti-Machado movement grew, the medical sector began to splinter along political lines, and new tendencies emerged within the FMC, openly articulating medical issues from clear political perspectives. These included the Izquierda Médica, or the Ala Izquierda Médica, or the medical left wing, which favored the linking of patient and physician demands and advocated for the radical expansion of public medical services, and was led by Gustavo Aldereguía, a former political prisoner and a member of the radical student organization Ala Izquierda Estudiantil. So the emergence of the Ala Izquierda Médica in late 1932 marks a key moment in the history of the Cuban Medical Federation, and indeed in the history of Cuban medicine. While Cuban physicians had for years been pushing for government reform and decrying the effects of Cuba's neo-colonial position on medical practice, the Ala Izquierda began to frame these concerns within a broadly socialist, anti-imperialist politics and pushed for the sweeping transformation of both the Cuban medical and political systems. For the Ala Izquierda, the medical crisis of the 1930s resulted both from Cuban neo-colonial dependency and the organization of medicine under capitalism, with medical services, quote, responding to the economic and political interests of dominant classes rather than the needs of patients or the economic interests of medical workers. So criticizing the lack of government investment in hospitals in public hospitals or medical services, the Ala Izquierda envisioned a radical expansion of government health services, including the growth of the hospital sector in the capital and in the provinces, the creation of new dispensaries for tuberculosis and other social diseases, and the establishment of public disability, health, and unemployment insurance. The Ala Izquierda saw a clear link between the interests of physicians and patients, and fought both for improved wages for medical workers and increased medical care for the Cuban poor, thereby opening up a space for patient-physician alliances that will become really important in the following years. While the FMC's executive committee called for broad unity among federated physicians, the ala izquierda actually emphasized the class cleavages within the Cuban medical sector. Not all doctors had the same situation in 1930s Cuba. The ala izquierda physicians actually hoped to advocate for the interests of the poor and middle class doctors that constituted really the majority of the Federation's membership. In the tumultuous period that began in the summer and fall of 1933, the ala izquierda began to take a leading position within the Federation and pushed for increasingly aggressive tactics to further the cause of the medical majority. Okay, so since my time is short, I'll give you sort of a brief sense of what follows, because it gets complicated. So I'll try to keep it simple. So in the fall of 1933, under pressure from the FMC, the new president, Grau, passes the Ley de Colegiación Médica Obligatoria, right? Requiring all Cuban doctors to be members in good standing of the National Medical College. In passing the Ley de Colegiación Médica Obligatoria, President Grau finally gave the Cuban Medical Federation the tool that they would need to force the centros regionales to accede to their demands. The law gave an official character to the Cuban Medical Federation, which itself then became the National Medical College, and required that all practicing physicians solicit membership within the National Medical College within 10 days of the law taking effect, which was September 20th. So those that continued to practice medicine in violation of the law would have their licenses revoked and be legally unable to, to practice medicine. So the new National Medical College could therefore force the centros regionales into accords, or the centros would risk the medical college barring its members from practicing medicine in these institutions. This gave the National Medical College enormous leverage. But naturally, the centros regionales resisted efforts to have their medical services be subject to the rules of the Medical Federation. So 5 of the capital's main Spanish immigrant institutions quickly organized a massive march and demonstration as a public show of force. So on September 27th, 1933, over 40,000 men and women marched in protest of the Ley de Colegiación Médica, which gives you a sense of the importance of this issue of colegiación and the medical college law. On the day of the protests, Spanish commerce across the island displayed its power as Spanish-run shops were closed, they shut their doors in solidarity with the centros. And as the New York Times correspondent in Havana noted, quote, many merchants believe that a general lockout of Spanish-run businesses will result if the government does not take steps to modify this decree. As reporters noted, a general lockout among commercial houses would completely paralyze industry and commerce on the island. So in response to Spanish immigrant pressure, the Grau government neglects to enforce its own law. And this gives the ala izquierda the space to push the FMC to attempt a more daring plan of organizing the general medical strike, which I started the talk with, linking the concerns of Cuban physicians with those of the rest of the medical sector and with Cuban patients. So the strike ended when the government agreed to many of the demands of the FMC, but just 2 weeks later, the Mendieta Batista government dissolved the National Medical College entirely. So that as part of this general moment of taking a strong hand with labor, the medical college is dissolved. So the Cuban Medical Federation loses its main weapon against the centros regionales. And since I'm really out of time, I just want to give you a sense of sort of the aftermath of this. And it's in the aftermath that we really begin seeing the members of the Cuban Medical Federation begin reflecting on sort of the failure of their efforts, that the ala izquierda sort of finds space to begin pushing for more radical alternatives, which becomes increasingly, if you follow what gets written in the Tribuna Médica and you follow the letters of these physicians, over the course of 1934 or 1935, what were initially very radical positions, we need a rapid expansion of state medicine, become the common sense alternative to what is an untenable situation for Cuban doctors during this period. Just to give you a sense of what the ala izquierda médica proposes, in a piece put forward by Eduardo Odio Perez, which becomes sort of the main thing that everyone responds to, he writes that the plan that they put forward is that, quote, all medical services, dental services, midwifery services, etc., would be controlled and underwritten by the state. And all hospitals, clinics, and pharmacies would be converted to state institutions. All services and medicines would be administered free of charge by the state. preventative medical care would be radically expanded, and physicians and medical services would be, quote, distributed throughout the territory in such a way that all citizens have easy access to them. Does it sound familiar? For those of you that know post-1960s Cuban medicine? So medical education would be free, but the number of medical professionals would be regulated according to the needs of the country. And while this plan is strikingly similar to the medical system that develops after the 1959 revolution, one key difference was that those physicians that did not want to join the state system would be free to continue in their private practice. And the idea, which I haven't done the math on, was that this would all be easily paid for with a 5% income tax on all public and private employees. So since we are out of time, I do want to say that really over the following year, Cuban medical politics does undergo a broad shift, and this is led partly by the ala izquierda and partly by the ala izquierda's leadership in a series of strikes that happened at public medical institutions over the course of 1934, where there are a series of local strikes at different public medical workers. Where they're protesting the terrible conditions in public hospitals and clinics and sanatoriums, which suffered from official neglect and poor funding. And these new medical struggles highlighted the failure of public health services to provide either adequate medical services to the Cuban poor or to give their employees a basic standard of living. So I guess with that, I'll just kind of run to the end. So Cuban historian, and we can talk more about this afterwards. So Cuban historian Jorge Ibarra has argued that the proletarianization of the middle classes during the post-war period helps explain the receptivity of the middle classes towards the revolution of 1959. While much more work needs to be done on the history of urban middle classes' participation in the revolution of 1933, it's clear that downward mobility and the loss of autonomy of the medical sector spurred the development of medical radicalism in the 1930s. When they saw their standards of living drop under what they saw as unfair competition, Cuban physicians initially turned to the state for protection, framing their struggle as a nationalist struggle against neocolonial Spanish oppression. But when the state proved unable to stand up to the powerful centros regionales, Cuban physicians grew increasingly receptive to the ala izquierda's call for more radical alternatives. The ensuing debates engaged for the first time with a fundamental question: to what degree should the provision of health services be organized by the capitalist market? If, as reformers had been arguing since the turn of the century, the state had a responsibility to protect the health of the Cuban people, if Cubans had a social right to health, then shouldn't the state take the lead in ensuring access to free or affordable health care? So, thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last speaker will be Ilan Ulrich, who teaches history at Bergen College and who's the author of Eduardo Chivas, The Incorrigible Man of Cuban Politics.
Thank you. As you can see, it's very dangerous to ask people of Cuban descent to limit themselves to 15 minutes. It reminds me a little bit, although I'm trying to escape this, my book about Eduardo Chivas and his final moments. He always had a 25-minute show, and he always spoke more than 25 minutes until the sponsor told him they were going to cut him off. And when Chivas finally shot himself, he meant it to ring out over the radio in 1951. And he did shoot himself, but everybody in Cuba was hearing an ad for Café Pilon. So this is something that we're working on. The problem with writing a book is when you're done with it, people say, well, what's next? So this talk kind of came out of that idea of what's next. And for me, I spent the summer in the archives in Cuba, and one of the things that always struck me about Cuban politics is in Havana, instead of advertisements, there are these placards that talk about the importance of being honest, the importance of being ethical, that sort of being ethical and honest is a major part of being a revolutionary and part of the revolution. And I wondered, I know from my work on Chivas that this is this is an idea that Chivas championed, but I found that it actually goes back a lot further. And I had an interesting experience reading letters, because my new project is going to be a biography of Ramon Grau San Martin, and I spent a lot of this summer reading letters to him while he was in exile in Miami. And one of the more interesting letters came from a Cuban who later became prominent as a press. He was a lawyer, but as a member of the press and kind of a political columnist named Raúl Alfonso Gonce. And he wrote this letter to Grau in 1938, and he explained to him that he'd been a member of the ABC during the 1933 revolution, but became very kind of disenchanted with the ABC and its violent tactics. And he was writing to Grau now in 1938 because he remembered the sacrifices of his father, who was a veteran in the Cuban War of Independence. And he felt that he needed to do something for his country. He felt that actually, he mentioned in the letter that as a lawyer, he'd been very successful, he had complete economic independence, but he felt these pangs of guilt. He mentioned this, that he felt embarrassed with his conscience because thinking of the sacrifices of his father during the War of Independence, that he had to do something for Cuba. And actually in 1938, he wrote this letter to Grau to explain why he had joined this Auténtico party. So really what I want to talk about is three things. One is I really want to try to get to the bottom of this question, which is, where does this idea of an extremely moral and ethical politics, which is still very strong in Cuba and still very present in Cuba, where does this come from? What's the origin of it? And I believe that the origin of it was in the early 1920s during the Patriots and Veterans movement. And I think one of the unique things about Cuba that doesn't get discussed that much is the fact that people in Cuba in the 1930s, in the 1940s, in the 1920s were living with the veterans of that independence war. They were there, they were walking around the streets, people remembered them as their fathers and their uncles and their family members. And the idea of the sacrifices of the soldiers of this war was very present in Cuba. And very basic things such as, in the early 1920s, this veterans movement was in many ways more equivalent. It wasn't a political party. It invited more equivalent party, sort of the political its movement, but really was more of a pressure group to try to pressure the government in some ways to make it feel guilty for not paying enough in terms of pensions, or trying to kind of force the government almost, put a little bit of a guilt trip on the government to say, we fought this war for independence and you're not taking care of us. And what's interesting is that they put out a lot of proclamations in the newspapers, and the movement kind of expanded beyond veterans. And one of the people in the 1920s whose signature appears on some of these documents is a younger Ramon Grau San Martin. And kind of the interesting thing to me is this idea, the veterans and the Patriots movement was more of a pressure group to try to pressure the government into sort of doing certain things, but they mention constantly, or you see certain words mentioned over and over again, words like, or terms like moral regeneration, or rectification, or corruption. And what's interesting is in the 1920s, a lot of this is rhetoric, and very few people take it to heart, and it's really a way to get the government to kind of react a little bit. But what happens is some people do take it to heart, and a younger Ramon Grau San Martin does take this to heart, and in some ways transmits this to a new generation in the later 1920s as a college professor. So that's kind of where we kind of see this take the next step. And what's interesting to me is, so this begins as kind of a pressure tactic from veterans in Cuban society, but it gets transformed to a tactic that some people take it to heart. Now, it's not seen as a very practical thing in Cuba. In many ways, politics in Cuba, and it makes a lot of sense in the 1920s, was really about gaining either a political position, or to get a family member or relative a place in a hospital, or to get it was a very practical thing, and this is really what the veterans were after in the beginning. But by the 1930s and by the revolution of 1933, you have a significant constituency of university students led by Grau, who really take this to heart and who kind of see this push for honesty and morality and regeneration and moral rectification in Cuba as a political idea or as a political platform. Just to give you a very quick sense, these are very kind of vague terms. Like you could say, well, what does moral generation mean, or what does moral rectification mean? Among the other things that kind of scandalized the veterans in Cuba were the fact that Cuban workers were being displaced by Haitians and Haitians and Jamaicans, for example. They were disgusted by corruption. Very famously, during the early 1920s, President Alfredo Zayas won the Cuban lottery not once but twice, and this was seen as a little bit too much. So this focus on corruption, this focus on these kind of things, was taken to heart by the 1933 by the students and by Grau, who was provisionally present during this time, and it's one of the reasons that Grau not only speaks in these terms, but he issues this 50% decree, which is an idea that was percolating really since the early 1920s. The problem with 1933 was Ramon Grau San Martin at this time did not belong to any political party. The students were not a political party. They were a very small group of the larger university population. So this provisional government, even though Grau's decrees did have some support, they were not backed by any political party in Cuba or any kind of large mainstream group within Cuba. So you have the ideas are briefly in power in 1933, but there's no real political party or any kind of real grassroots effort to really kind of make this into a mainstream political idea in Cuba, which brings me to 1938, because in 1938, after a period of time where most or some political parties had been outlawed by the Batista government or the Batista kind of strongman rule in Cuba, in 1938 Cuba was heading towards a constituent assembly, and Batista promised not only a fair election, but he also promised that all political parties in Cuba, including the Auténticos, which had been founded in 1934, but had been largely illegal, could participate. And so in 1938, the Auténtico Party really has a chance to organize as a political party on a large scale, and there's this very, very drastic fight within the party in terms of what kind of party it's going to be. There are Auténtico hardliners, including Grau, who feel that the party really needs to be the party of this idea, these ideas from the veterans movement, that the party should not accept any kind of government budgets, that the party is not in this for political power. The party's slogan is Cuba for the Cubans. And so Grau feels like the most important thing for this party to do is to gain the faith and the trust of the Cubans, the Cuban population, and also makes these public proclamations saying the point of this party is not to win positions for the members of the party or for people in the party to benefit, which had traditionally been the point of Cuban politics. You join a political party because you can get something out of it. You can get a political job. You can become an inspector of coffee, even if you live in Havana and you've never seen a coffee plant. But you could get something out of being in politics, something very practical. And here is Grau saying, this is not that this is not a party that's going to do that kind of thing. This is a party that is really going to try to be something new in the Cuban political arena. This is not going to be a party for personal gain. It's really going to try to spread Cuba's natural wealth among Cubans. But you had many members of the Auténtico Party in 1938 who called themselves realists, who felt that this program of Grau was kind of a utopian thing. And there was this a little bit of a struggle within the party for how the party was going to be. And Batista, who also saw himself as a potential presidential figure, wanted to divide this party. So you had members of the Auténtico Party who started to gravitate towards Grau, among them Rubén de León, a very well-known student leader. But the way they tried to do this was they started going to Auténticos who were grassroots members of the party, who were members of municipal assemblies, who were members of the National Executive Committee, and saying, if you play ball with the government, you'll get a budget for your electoral campaign once the elections come for the Constituent Assembly, or that you can get a job, you can get a government job, you can get a public job, and a lot of auténticos who were in very humble financial circumstances were really kind of forced to choose. Do they take this job? Do they take this kind of money? Do they take this, which they really needed, or do they kind of follow this hard line of the auténticos? And there was very much kind of a civil war within the party. And in the end, by November of 1938, the auténtico hardliners, including Grau, are able to expel most of these so-called realists from the party. And it really marks an interesting moment because you have a mainstream party in Cuba for the first time that explicitly states that this is not going to be a party of patronage, that this is not going to be a party where its members join it to get a job or where its members join it to sort of gain financially, that this is going to be a party explicitly to share Cuba's wealth among Cuba's people. And this is really, for me, a watershed moment because this is really the first time that these ideas that had been, circulating around since the early 1920s, that they become the ideas of a major political party in Cuba, and a political party that has the prospects to rule Cuba and is a very genuinely popular party in Cuba. As some of you know, or many of you probably know, Grau actually won those Constituent Assembly elections, which were honestly held in 1939. So it's this very interesting prospect that you have a political party that explicitly states that it's gonna follow these ideas, that its members are explicitly going to reject becoming wealthier to sort of gain these high positions. And this is in direct contrast to Batista. Batista, who is of humble origins, by the late 1930s, he still is getting a very modest official salary, but everybody can see that he's doing very well. So this is kind of, offers Cubans this choice to go back to this time. So last but not least, I want to just kind of come back to this letter of Raul Alfonso Conce, because he wrote to Grau talking about his father, and he said, I don't aspire to any kind of political position. I'm not that interested in politics in general, but he said, I feel like I have to do something for my country to make it a more decent place, to honor the memory of my father. And he says, the place for me where I felt that I could actually do this, the only place where I felt like I could do this was in the Auténtico party. So for me, this is kind of this watershed moment. Now, later on, the Auténticos kind of soiled their reputation in a number of ways. But what's interesting to me is you see this continuity, because this is today a very big part of Cuban politics. But the first time that this kind of politics has the explicit backing of a mainstream Cuban party is in 1938. So thank you for listening to me, and I hope I kept to the time.
Well, those all raise so many fascinating issues, and it's really striking to me the intersections and connections among them around a number of themes, including nationalism, internationalism, and race, among other things, and imperialism. So I will open this up for discussion. Maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions and then direct them to the panel.
It's great to see Puerto Padre and Oriente finally discussing academic fora, right? Many of us are from there, John is from that part of the woods, from that Oriente. Were there any other Orientales? No other Orientales. So, I have 2 questions there. Francis, that's a very complex topic, and congratulations on a very innovative approach to something that is understudied. The whole set of uprisings in Centrales, combination of forces, still complex. You try to understand them better, you offer some ideas that illuminate what's going on. I also wonder to what extent Antonio Guitera's force was still behind some of those networks. Antonio Guterres was active in Oriente 2 or 3 times, including the early revolution, the Grau, just before the Grau and then in Grau. And he was using Oriente to promote the idea of uprising, right, for on clear purpose. He was not a communist, so I'm surprised. Well, I wonder what happened with what they're playing in Cuba, but he was not, even though he was a leftist, he was not a communist. And he certainly was more into broader issues than race issues, right? So I wonder whether he's playing a big role there. And yeah, for you, the question that I have is, what I read from you is a very fascinating account of a sector of the medical profession, nascent, one which is statist, and is trying to get space from that which had been there since the 19th century from the Spaniards, societies by immigrant communities. And you said 400,000 at one point they demonstrated?
176,000 members in Havana.
470.
176. But just around Havana, pretty much. So
That's very powerful.
Right.
And they certainly controlled Centro Gallego, which was the most developed such center in Cuba. And I think they had a red network of clinics and hospitals.
yeah.
And it was, from what I read, quite high quality service.
Yep.
And then you had a new nascent sector within the framework of this new set of ideas, which is trying to develop a state medicine, if you will, right? So you have a very neat conflict between private, but it's really funny sense of private because it's really mutual aid, it's communal, ethnic communities, and then the state center pattern. And I have many more questions, but my comment is really how excited I am to hear new research and new topics. And I'm not belittling what Sam had to say about not all the interpretation, but certainly it's very exciting to see the 3 of you, the younger generation, doing great topics, exciting research. And Ilan, for you, what question would I have for you? Boy, what an irony. I mean, los puros del auténticos, no? Who are they kidding? They were as much of opportunistas once they got to power as anyone else. At least that's the reputation they develop further on, right? So what are they kidding? What are they happening? Who are they kidding in a broader sense? The question is also, the relationship to of course to Chivas, right? El paladín de la honestidad, no? And Chivas leaves the party, was he? And then the other question is, what happened to the oportunistas, to the ones who were in the party for normal democratic purposes, like what you would find in New York City, even today, people fighting for jobs, for patronage, for services. Well, it's normal, that's what politics is about in the democratic framework. We have the 3 questions. I have many more for Sam, but they are broader questions of interpretation. I want to say that. And one last thing, Julie, we do want to continue and deepen this forum on the Cuban Republic. It's colloquium, so we look forward to your inputs and ideas. Maybe we'll do a book later at some point. But we are very excited about the new research and the old research as well. And we hope we can do even deepen this study.
Okay, thank you. That was a whole number of questions altogether. And there'll be another round for more. Is there anybody else who would like to join this round? Yes?
Yeah. As far as thank you very much, all of you. My grandmother brought my father here from Cuba when he was 8 years old. And of course, I was born during the Depression, but he always wanted to go back to Havana and he wanted me to go. And of course, now it looks like the door will be opened again because at the time that I wanted to go, that I was able to go, of course, we had the revolution and Castro was here. But the thing is, with the medicine, I understand that every baby in Cuba gets a doctor. I happened, when I lived in Mexico, had a very friendship with a very wealthy family. And when the mother became very ill, she had a couple of strokes. And now these are wealthy people, but they sent her to Cuba because I guess, well, so I want to know, is it because the treatment is better there, more professional, or, because everybody says to me, well, in Cuba it's free, so, and they have money, why, so, that is, I wonder if you could clear that up for me a little bit.
Okay, last question.
My question is for Danielle. I wonder, I guess this
Speak
might
louder.
sorry, this might be a broader question in terms of thinking of doctors as workers, as laborers. But I wonder if you found any documentation in terms of medical workers writing about why they were striking, any sense of them grappling with kind of the ethical issue of medical workers striking? Like you said, people died, babies were in danger when they were born because they weren't working. So how did they kind of negotiate their very reasonable demands as workers with their ethical obligations too?
Can you hear me? Yeah, Gutierrez, yeah. Which is basically Joven Cuba was active in the countryside, but they weren't fomenting revolution. The insurgency attached to the mills was not necessarily. I would have to learn more about the Joven Cuba connection. I will say that an interesting moment with respect to the Grau administration and its Minister of Labor is when the mill workers struck at Chapada. And Delicias.
I'm from there.
Yeah, okay. So you might know the story that when the mill workers struck, and eventually were locked, they struck for 34 days. When they were locked out, the Grau administration stepped in and forced Puerto Padre municipal authorities to open the plant, the hospital, and the commissary, and the housing. So I think in terms of the specifics of his role, I'm not totally clear, to be honest, but I know the administration he was involved in kind of set a new standard that Batista would then take up for intervention in labor disputes on the sugar centrales in the aftermath of this kind of extraordinary moment at Puerto Padre when they stepped in to forcibly open the hospital. Yeah, and like I said, Joven Cuba was active in the countryside, but they were more collecting information. The documents that I've seen are more sort of survey results and not any kind of collaboration, but I could be wrong.
Hi. Yeah, just on your comments, Mauricio's comment on sort of the enemy being the mutual aid societies, which is itself really interesting because you do get in the United States some reporting that in the 1930s and 1940s that looks at these, because what's happening in Cuba is very much under the microscope for doctors elsewhere in the Americas. And interestingly, there's a lot of reporting in the United States within the medical press in the US as they see the way in which like the medical marketplace is sort of is transitioning and sort of the politics around mutual aid medicine particularly. Given that U.S. doctors are very much concerned during the 19-teens and 20s with maintaining sort of a professional autonomy and the private practice, they are looking at what's happening with the mutual aid societies as like this is what could happen if we go towards like insurance models. This is what could happen if like, some version of medical mutualism gains traction in the United States. So there's a lot of worry about that. Although interestingly then by the 1940s, you start getting reporting in the United States looking at the mutual aid medical system as a model for how healthcare could be transformed in the United States to provide low-cost medical care to people without like a state-run system, right? So it is interesting that like the enemy, and it's interesting that like with the ala izquierda, like you sort of skip over. You don't talk about private practice because it's sort of politically dangerous within the FMC to denigrate private practice because that's sort of like still by the 1930s, like, people go into medicine generally, like up through this period, with the idea that they're going to have private practices, they have professional autonomy, not work for someone else. So that's still very much like a guiding sort of ethic or goal, a professional goal within the medical community. So the ala izquierda kind of like leapfrogging over that issue to make an end run towards state medicine is really interesting, right? I think I need to think about that more. On the question of treatment in Cuba, actually, it's funny. I literally got an email today from a friend whose parents are British, who are going to Cuba next week to get medical care. Right. So and this is they're in the UK, which has excellent state-run medical system, but they're going to Cuba.
Yeah. Why?
I don't know actually. I didn't get that far. I was supposed to give them more tips about getting through Havana.
But it's not free for foreigners, though.
Right. Sure. Yeah. So I think it's important to note that it isn't free for foreigners. I'm not an expert on post-1959 Cuban medicine.
It's free for foreigners.
It's not free for foreigners.
Oh, it's not.
free for Cubans, but foreigners do have to pay.
Right.
Okay.
Medical tourism is a very important
Right.
part.
It's
So
still
the
relatively
Mexican family
reasonable.
wouldn't have to pay.
Sure, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And it's certainly like an important source of income for the Cuban government. And
Because
it's,
that wasn't clear to me, because they were saying, yeah, but why is she going to Cuba's free?
Right.
But not for foreigners.
Right.
Okay.
On the issue of doctors as laborers, and to what degree they sort of engage with some of the obviously ethical problems, given the fact that they swear oaths to not hurt people and you're going on strike. One of the reasons why medical strikes, especially a general medical strike, are incredibly rare. Medical strikes where that's actually happening right now in the UK. There's some medical strikes where junior doctors are going on strike, I think this coming week. But like having a general medical strike where no medical care is being given, those are incredibly rare for precisely those reasons. And I think the outpouring of antipathy towards the doctors is in a sense it backfired, right? Like people they expected people to be upset about it, but I don't think they expected the fire bombings, the assassinations, like the mobs of people, right? There was some support, of course. The labor movement did have protests in support of Cuban doctors during the strike, but they were sort of swamped by the people that were very upset with Cuban doctors for going on strike for obvious reasons, right? Interestingly upset. Reading the sort of sources from the period, doctors sort of admit that it was very unpopular, but they're not willing to at least in their writing sort of talk about their own ethical qualms about having done that kind of labor action. But I think it's an important question.
Any other responses?
In terms of the Auténticos and what happened later, I think it's important to just emphasize that this is before the Auténticos took power, and for me the interesting thing is this idea of a kind of a very moralistic government that explicitly states that it's not going to seek the personal gain of its members. This is something new in Cuba in terms of a political platform for any political party in Cuba. So what happened later is obviously something that many Auténticos are renege on this, or when they get power they become very wealthy. But there were some Auténticos who stayed true to this as well. Even after the Ortodoxo party was started, there were still many kind of true blue Auténticos who kind of really believed this. And this was a popular thing within the party, and it was popular enough to get the so-called realists expelled from the party in 1938 too. So there was a reservoir of support for this. And the fact that it didn't work out is certainly one issue, but the strain remained in Cuban politics to the point where I'm thinking of a passage in Samuel's book about the origins of the Cuban Revolution Reconsidered, where he says that young revolutionaries in the 50s took this disgust with so-called politiquería, or kind of this political corruption and pettiness, as a starting point for being a revolutionary, and that feeling very much comes from this era.
Can I comment? Yeah, I just would like to comment a couple of things on Well, thank you very much for your very stimulating presentation. And I think
The mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was thanking Ilan for and all the other people here. I think has been a terrific session. On the question of honesty, I think that in terms of the origin of the idea, I think, in my opinion, we have to go to Martí and the sacralization, if that word makes sense, of the thinking of José Martí in the 20th century, where it's not specifically honesty, but certainly sacrifice of the fatherland, dedication, not looking out for number one type of thing. And I think that idea from Martí is very important, and also important in the 50s with the Generación del Centenario and all of these notions. Now, on the other hand, I think the issue of why, when they come to power, the great majority of them become as corrupt as anybody else, although the corruption under Batista's second regime even surpassed any corruption under the Auténticos. I think that in a country like Cuba, even if Cuba was ranking number 4 in the economic development among Latin American countries in the 50s, it was still a less developed country. And I think that you cannot look, in my opinion, again, at political, administrative corruption or honesty in the abstract as a question of ideas. The question is that the political system becomes an avenue of social mobility itself, of moving up in the world, not because people are evil, but because of the lack of alternative opportunities. And unless you have also an alternative revolutionary movement that offers an alternative set of moral standards, and in practice, then all this preaching is going to go to naught when the people come to office and the society hasn't changed. So they're going to say, I have to make it like everybody else. This is no different, fundamentally no different that went on before. So why am I being a fool? I have to use this opportunity to have my family improve its situation, send my children to university, etc., etc. So I think there is a material context for these things that cannot be ignored, which doesn't mean that I am dismissing ideas as if they're not important. No, I think the ideas are very important, but within a material context.
Let me just add one more thing, that the Auténticos went into the 1940 election very much with this idea that they were going to run a very clean campaign. The Auténticos didn't have a lot of money, but we have to keep in mind that Ramón Grau San Martín, who was a doctor who made a lot of money in private practice, was a wealthy man from a well-off family. Eduardo Chibas, who was a young congressional candidate. Also, Chibas, for example, even though he had a lot of money, didn't spend any money on his campaign, just to sort of prove that it was possible to win a congressional seat or to win in politics without any kind of, big kind of financial advantages. For Grau in 1940, this didn't work so well because he lost. And I think this caused some Auténticos, and I think in some cases Grau, to sort of be more realistic 4 years later. And in fact, in 1944, Chibas actually loaned Grau about 25,000 pesos of his own money, which is an extraordinary amount in 1940, because the average Cuban salary was the equivalent of about $300. The peso and the dollar were equal at that time. So even somebody like Chibas felt like, well, maybe this idea of not spending any money in politics, there have to be some concessions. Obviously, he came to regret that. But one of the interesting things is they kind of bumped up against reality in 1940. And Grau, at least, I think one of the conclusions he drew was that maybe it's impossible to win. And is it worth it to just lose and make a good point, or is it more important to win? So that's another thing to think about.
What about the elections of 1952, when Mendieta was obviously not the favorite and the Partido Chivas Party, the Ortodoxos seemed to be winning on the elections that obviously Batista prevailed. But is there any historical evidence? Because I read somewhere that there were some rumors in Cuba that Prio would be playing around with elections to try to some level of corruptions to make sure that the elections would go favorably to the Auténticos, and Mendieta would be able to win and not let the Ortodoxos take power, because obviously one of the big issues of the Ortodoxos was the anti-corruption platform, and obviously there was corruption issues, especially in the Department of Education and so forth. Is there any historical evidence of any efforts on behalf of Prio, the Auténticos, to kind of like temper with the elections of 1952?
Sure. Do we want to take other questions?
Yeah, collect a few questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Especially because we don't have that much time left. I also wanted to add a question there. It was very striking to me that Ilan's paper presented, I think, the Veterans Association as a source not only of a notion of honesty and sort of national nobility, but that they were very nationalist in their proposals. Whereas, of course, the War for Independence had tremendous internationalist dimensions to it, including Maceo's work in other countries, Martís, forms of organization, the concern for Puerto Rico's independence. And so I was just struck by that particular configuration of the Veterans Association and the creation of and also veterans, how there's this other strain that Francis's paper pointed out, and at least in the early 30s, of internationalism, which also had cut across. So I don't know how if these were for very much time, kind of contending understandings of reform at that particular period. And then I'm kind of taking a little bit of liberties here, but also about the Spanish medical association, or rather the mutual aid associations, and your comment that they were open to Cubans of Spanish descent and not of Afro-Cuban descent. Whereas, of course, there are many people who were mixed. And so how did that work out? It was somebody's mixed. It was a Cuban, and was that close to them? Okay, any other question? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Amr. I'm an Egyptian diplomat. I used to work in North Korea for 2 years before, so I can understand how the country you're talking about looks like. And my question is related to anti-imperialism feelings that was prevailing during the 30s and 40s at the time, that was leading to a revolutionary change, or that way. Do you think that the factors or the source of factors that leading to these feelings are still existing now in Cuba, and whether in a time of globalization, whether it's still existing, and if it is existing, do you think that it can lead to a major change, or on one of the two ways, whether it's positive or negative? So to compare the history to the current situation. Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the question about Prio and tampering with the election, I've definitely heard about this. I've never seen any evidence to confirm this. This was one of the things I've heard this in two contexts. One, that this was an excuse for the army to overthrow Prio. Mm-hmm. You also had, it's important to keep in mind at the time that you had a lot of professors in the Cuban military college who were close associates of Chivas. For example, his cousin Roberto Agramonte was a professor at this college. Rafael Garcia Bárcena was also a professor at this war college. They were all appointed when they were auténticos, of course, but they became ortodoxos, and they kind of transmitted these ideas. And so a lot of the kind of younger generation of officers were very idealistic. But I haven't seen any evidence that Prio was going to tamper with this election. I also think in many ways it's premature to, I read a lot of things that say, well, obviously the auténtico candidate was going to lose. But interestingly enough, the candidate in 1952 was Carlos Evia, who was in many ways, or the two main candidates were Carlos Evia for the auténticos and Roberto Agramonte for the ortodoxos, and they were kind of running neck and neck. The latest poll that I've seen is they both had kind of support in the low 30s, but the auténticos had a much better network or a much better political apparatus of getting out the vote, and they had offices in every small town in Cuba, whereas the ortodoxos didn't really have this. So it's not necessarily far-fetched to think that the auténticos could have won again, especially as Carlos Evia. The interesting thing is that two candidates were very similar in the fact that they were both kind of honest. They were very drab. Neither one was very charismatic. Agramonte's nickname, even among the ortodoxos, was a freezer bottle. And there were all kinds of anecdotes that when he would get up to speak, even in ortodoxo meetings, people would sort of get up and leave and say, oh, it's lunchtime, or oh, you know. So he was kind of like your typical garden variety, like droning, boring college professor, because he was also a professor at the University of Havana.
A sociologist, no less.
Yes, and
Masaboba.
yeah, he was also called Masaboba. Yeah,
Which to this day, my wife is Mexican, so I've educated my wife to refer to a neighbor of ours as Masaboba.
but he another nickname was la botella del congelador, which I mean, I'm not sure what that means, but it's certainly not positive. And then Carlos Evia, again, had a very distinguished, you know, he was the first Cuban to graduate from the Naval Academy at Annapolis, was a very brave man, a very rigid opponent of Machado. But again, no charisma whatsoever, but a long record of honesty. And in many ways, maybe again, this is a tribute to this idea of the importance of honesty, that in a country like Cuba that really values a charismatic political figures, you had these two opponents in 1952, neither of whom, you know, were good speakers, neither of whom, you know, Evia had a lot of kind of technocratic experience. Agramonte had been the ambassador of Cuba to Mexico. But neither one of these guys, you know, could rile up an audience or get people fired up in the way that, you know, we think of as this essential thing in Cuban politics. So in some senses, maybe that's a tribute to this strain of the importance of honesty as well. In terms of the question about the veterans and the nationalist tendencies, I think one thing to keep in mind, and I've seen a lot of political cartoons to this effect well into the late 1940s and early 1950s, is the disappointment that veterans felt that they'd sacrificed so much and the suffering during the war was so dramatic and so great, and that they fought and they were very disappointed with the results of this, that the Cuban Republic was this tremendous disappointment. This is something that comes out over and over and over again. I remember reading in Bohemia, actually in Cartel, I don't know if it's Bohemia or Carteles, but there's this political cartoon where there's a little girl who asks her father, she says, Papa, what's a politician? You know, Dad's reading the paper, and he goes nuts, and he like spits out the cigar, and he bellows at the girl. He says, "Where did you learn how to say bad words?" And this idea that you know, politicians were these kind of evil, kind of corrupt people, and this idea, you know, I've seen other cartoons where it shows an old veteran of the war, and he says, this is not, you know, he's reading the paper, and he says, this is not the republic that I imagined. And there was this tremendous sense of disappointment, and I think part of that comes from this, I think the nationalist sentiment comes from this disappointment that what was created, or the Cuban Republic, was not something that really met their expectations, and there was this tremendous sense of unmet expectations.
Could I add? Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right, but I think there's something that is also very important. Oh, I'm sorry. I agree with what Ilan just said, but I think there's another element that is critically important with the veterans, and it's racism, and that is the exclusion, systematic exclusion of the black veterans from any of the perquisites of power that they were entitled to, and by that I mean public employment. I'm not talking about, you know, anything. And of course, you know, this was expressed in many different ways, the miserable treatment that Quintin Banderas was subjected to. And there are lots of examples of the racism that was part of that half-baked oligarchy that in 15 minutes I tried to present here. With more time, I would have elaborated a lot more on that, but you gave me the opportunity to bring that issue to the fore. And there are many people who have studied this thing. Ala Ferrer, you know, and NYU, and many other people have written about this, and I think it's a critical, important part of Cuban history, especially of that period.
Yes, and it culminated in the massacre of the Partido.
Absolutely, 1912.
Right, and actually, thank you for reminding me of that. It reminds me of a letter that I've seen of Chivas, who wrote to Jorge Mañach, because in the early 1930s, actually right after during the provisional presidency of Grau, Chivas tried to lure the ABC to joining GRAO and backing GRAO, and he felt that this would stabilize the government and lead to the United States recognizing him. And he mentions this meeting, and he says at this ABC meeting, he says that, and at the time there was this, GRAO was backed by Fulgencio Batista, and the ABC said they had nothing against GRAO, who they called a decent Cuban and an illustrious university professor, but members of the ABC explicitly said there was no way that they could support Fulgencio Batista because he was black. So that's, I'm glad that someone reminded me of that. Thanks.
Am I fielding the really big question about nationalism versus internationalism? And about anti-nationalism? Okay, so basically in my mind, I don't see how they're disentangled. From the start of the Cuban Republic, you have a nation that is so heavily weighed down by, the Goliath of the United States. And so, I could pick any number of topics, I'm sure we all could, in which we talk about how they're so disentangled, or so they're so entangled. But to speak specifically about the Communist Party, it's founded by, representatives of the student movement, socialists, and veterans of the War for Independence from Spain. So even from the beginning of the Communist Party, it's unique in that it is so nationalist. But then, of course, these things become tensions. And in the 30s, when the Communist Party, probably the only time it was really getting directives from Moscow, was so deliberately, proletarian solidarity, internationalism, it made a fundamental mistake by not aligning itself with Quiteras. By not involving itself in the more reform or the more radical elements of the Grau administration and building an alliance. And it did that largely out of a commitment to this internationalism at the cost of nationalism. It's a strategic mistake. I don't know if it's an ideological mistake, but they're so entangled I wouldn't even know where to begin.
I think that more than mistake, it was the policy of the third period. And the policy of the third period is that at that stage in the Communist Party from 1928 to exactly when it ends is not totally clear until it's replaced by the Popular Front 34, 35. And the third period was had an international expression and a Soviet expression. The Soviet expression was the ultra-left sectarian line to justify the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union that included a deliberately created famine in the Ukraine, absolutely horrendous atrocity. And internationally, the international version of that is to denounce every other left and forget about parties that were not even on the left as some kind of reactionary mass. So the Cuban party faithfully followed that international policy of the Comintern. And in the case of Germany, had absolutely disastrous, catastrophic results because that policy defined the Social Democrats as social fascists. And therefore, the German communists, who were a very important force, refused to ally with the German Social Democrats to prevent Hitler from coming to power. And that policy was fatal in that it helped, and the Social Democrats were no bargain either because they were extremely conservative and inhibited in taking aggressive action. But that combination of the conservatism of the Social Democrats in Germany and the sectarian, insane, ultra-left line of the third period helped to bring Hitler to power in Germany.
But it's like the Communist Party in Cuba continually calling Grau a fascist.
Right.
I mean, it's ridiculous. The historiography always refers to the August mistake, when this, this brief moment when the communists agreed to kind of collaborate with Machado and end the strike, and of course the strike continues, and it was a tactical error. But the big mistake is labeling Grau a fascist and not collaborating in any way with this with this massive reform potential.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why I asked the questions about the Communist Party. They did the same thing with Batista. They had a period where they collaborated.
But that's a different story.
That's a different story.
Yeah, which I think has to do with the Spanish Civil War.
But they're really not as key a player in organizing the things, in my view, as perhaps other actors. Can I make a comment?
We just have a couple minutes and we have two questions in the back.
Danielle didn't speak yet.
I just to briefly answer the question on Cubans of color being denied membership within the centros.
Right.
It's funny, like how it's such a tradition by the 1920s and 30s where you start really where it gets mentioned. It gets mentioned sort of like as an afterthought. It's just like how things are. Like even when the U.S. does a report in 1935. Looking at medical conditions on the ground, they try to mention it offhand that like Cubans of color denied membership. And I've been looking for Cubans of color sort of engaging with that. But they aside from there's the Fraternidad or the I can't remember the name of the organization, but there was one Afro-Cuban mutual aid organization that did create its own clinic. But there's only one, and so it was never like a sort of big counter movement to like create new spaces among Cubans of color. In fact, there was a lot of criticism of that, saying that like no, we shouldn't take that route. We shouldn't go the route of like our own like racially segregated, even though the reality on the ground was racial segregation, right? On the issue of so a quick pitch for when thinking about sort of the anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism of this period, like is like from the perspective of Cuban doctors, like Spanish colonialism was and neo-colonialism was a reality. And like one thing that I think this makes clear is like, you know, and people on the ground certainly noticed it in the 19-teens and 20s. They talk about the incredible power of Spanish commerce. But like historians haven't yet like really grappled so much with the incredible power of Spanish commerce and the way in which the Spanish completely dominate like the you know like trade in the early, especially like on the urban level. During the early decades of the 20th century, with incredible implications that, like, certainly in the case of medicine, like, was everything, but I think has a lot greater implications that we still haven't confronted.
That's fascinating. Was there, yes?
I have a sort of hypothetical question for Professor Farmer. I'm very interested in the fact that a number of artists and writers who were born in the decade of the teens, who were members of the Communist Party in the 30s at a certain point, I'm particularly focused on the transition that these artists go through. By the time Grau was elected in '44, and then Lee was elected after that, these artists, many of them remain in the Cuban CP, and yet they have no difficulty cooperating in all kinds of cultural enterprises that were part of that period. Do you have any idea, you know, I would just like some feedback from you. What do you think allowed for them to have that kind of shift and transition?
Well, should I comment?
Yeah, maybe we have one more question?
Yeah, one more question.
Oh, there's a gentleman right behind you.
You can go ahead.
Okay, we just have, I don't know how strict we have to be about ending, that's all.
No, we can go a little bit.
Okay.
One.
So yes, I want to know a little bit on the connection of the Spanish Civil War and the emigres, the Spanish emigres out of Spain in the Cuban political scene in those decades.
And did you have a question? What do you say?
Well, there's so many questions that I will only raise 2 or 3, but not for now, for later. We do want to continue discussing these issues. So I think the issue of the rotation of oligarchy reminds me of Marifeli's challenging somebody. In Cuba, there was no oligarchy in that time. We were all fragmented, we were divided, fighting against each other. There was no unified oligarchy in the Cuban of the teens and 20s, and not after the war of independence. Still fragmented, they were fighting for power, as we know, and there were all kinds of uprisings. I would probably, you know. So I kind of tend to, I would, for the future, challenge that view, monolithic view of Cuban society is there's oligarchical, but I don't have a better term. But I think is that there's a problem with that because it really is nothing comparable to what happened in Latin America, where you do have, you know, many decades of conflict forge various well-established land-based oligarchies even in Venezuela. In Cuba, that was not the case. I'm getting myself retracted.
Do you have a question? Because we have to wind up.
Well, I think the issue, we need to go back to the issues you raised, Ilan, also. And I'd like to know more about one of the groups that has not been mentioned at length, which the more I read, the more I found to have been very powerful, engaged in the events of the 30s, many of them bloody. And I think it's a bit of a mischaracterization to view them only as racist, the ISA. And they were responsible for the major uprising of late 1933, which closes that cycle, right? And you had a cell-type organization where you had many different leaders. Some of them may have been racist, but then Mañach, you really couldn't accuse him of being racist, and many there are others. So I think we need to talk more about the ABC, I would say, and to kind of clarify more of the issue.
Yeah, I think that we also wind it up.
The future, but I'd like to see more research. Again, Guterres, he is against a faction of the revolutionaries, including the RSA. He gets killed in 1935 by that example. Before that, he kills a number of players. So how are we to read Antonio Guterres, who was a key player? So the RSA, Guterres, those were key players, allied to Batista for a while, and then they lose. I'm going to stop there. I have more questions than anything. This is really more in the spirit of posing issues for the future.
Okay, you all have like a chance to briefly answer.
Can I? Yeah, very briefly.
What's the mic?
What's the question?
In regards to Mauricio's point, I very deliberately call it a half-baked oligarchy.
You did.
And yes, an attempt to imitate other Latin American patterns with the white officer class in the army, with the liberal conservative duopoly, and it was a project of oligarchy. Maybe that word would be more accurate, and it was half-baked, and whatever half-baked was up to the 1930s became unbaked, if that's the right word, after 33. That's all. Now, about the issue, Alejandro, that you raised, very briefly, it's relevant to the periods in the Communist Party history, because once that ultra-sectarian, insanely sectarian, ultra-left, etc., which explains the opposition to Guterres and the Auténticos, then they enter into the Popular Front, and beyond the Popular Front, they enter into an alliance with Batista. And beyond the alliance with Batista, they enter into a national front during World War II, where the Soviet Union and the United States were allies. And in fact, their politics in the 1940s undermined, not contributed, but undermined anti-imperialism in Cuba, and was one of the elements that came into the picture for the absence of anti-imperialist politics in Cuba for 20 years. That is, from the late 30s to the late 50s, there is no anti-imperialist politics in Cuba. So much so that the only people who used the word anti-imperialist were the members of the Cuban Communist Party. Nobody else used that word because it had been completely absent. As a matter of fact, even the word left was not used in Cuba in the 40s and 50s, let alone anti-imperialism.
I can be very brief. So I think Daniel's point about the historians haven't yet come to terms with the importance, the weight of sort of Spanish neocolonialism. We get American neocolonialism. It's really important, but one thing I want to add is that Cuba is unique in the Americas for having Spanish immigrants. And that's a product of US policies of whitening, right? Deliberately inviting during the occupation and afterwards Spanish people to come and help whiten the island. So that's unique.
But that also happened automatically. Fidel's father was an immigrant.
Yeah, absolutely. I've sent several. So given this extra Spanish immigration, whereas Mexico and Argentina and Venezuela get to foreclose Spanish immigration, given that Cuba actually has the reverse experience, it's much more steeped in the Spanish Civil War, right, on both sides. So there's phalangists, but there's also people that are very supportive of the Spanish Republic, the besieged republic, right? And it mobilizes more brigadistas than any other country in Latin America, than the rest combined, actually. So it's a truly important and at times divisive story in Cuban history, and I think it has a lot to, that generation that sort of came of age then play a big role in the revolution later. That's all to say that yes, immigrants were really important to this story. That's it.
what are we left with in terms of the interpretation of why the endings end the way they did? Do you have one? Do you have interpretation? Ms. Samuel offer an interpretation, more or less. Do you have one of what the Republic was about and why it ended in the first phase in the late 30s?
Can I just ask, I'm not sure, did you get a chance to answer the other two gentlemen's questions?
I think so, yeah.
You did, okay.
Grand interpretation of the Republic?
Well, at least up until the late 30s.
Right.
By the 1939, we had a constitution, we had a new government, we had democracy, we had the revolutionary cycle ends.
Right.
In the late second half of the 30s. So.
I mean, not really, no. I guess it's like.
Can I help you like that?
Can I help, Daniel? I think mine, and also to some extent Daniel's, and I think to an extent Franny too. It's this idea of continuity. For a long time, or at least the Cuban Revolution tried to push this idea that the revolution was this complete break with the past. Mainly, there's the break with the relationship with the United States, but in a lot of ways, there's a lot of continuity between Cuba today and how Cuba was in the past, which makes a lot of sense. But it's certainly not something you would hear in Cuba or within the Cuban government, because the revolution was really supposed to represent this abrupt and very deliberate break with the past. But one of the things for me that's very interesting is, for a long time, one of the hallmarks of the Cuban government was to get hundreds of thousands of people out to march for any number of different causes. But for me, I remember reading all kinds of accounts in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Whenever the government wanted to get people out for an event or to sort of out for a political rally, all public employees had to show up or they would be fired. So there's this long history of the Cuban government, just in that and many other respects, as a way of mobilizing people and mobilizing crowds. So, yeah.